Bullshit.
Pretend for a moment we've entered a parallel universe, free of bullshit and full of bold solutions. That's what the No BS Show's all about. I'm your host, Dave Mastovich, and let's cut the bullshit. Which of the following applies to your company? Number one, an employee repeatedly misses deadlines or makes mistakes but doesn't hear about it from the boss. Number two, a coworker has, quote, protected status and can pretty much do things how and when they want. Number three, a manager is blatantly incompetent but somehow survives again and again. And number four, all of the above. Unfortunately, many people probably answer all of the above. Why? The avoidance approach to problem solving has become an accepted practice. Workplace conflicts and problems are inevitable and often result from some combination of unclear expectations, poor communication, lack of clear authority, and differing attitudes and skill sets of workers. Subscribing to the "if I ignore it, maybe it'll go away" philosophy doesn't solve anything and instead leads to more problems. As painful as it might seem, addressing an issue or conflict directly will reduce stress for you and others. You could start by clearly defining the problem and making sure you're not part of it. Try to understand the whys behind the problem and the people involved. Develop some creative potential solutions other than everyone else being fired except you. Then discuss the situation and your ideas openly without making any personal attacks or assailing anyone's character. If your boss is part of the problem or allowing it to occur, you still need to take the time to assess the situation. Ask your boss for some time to discuss an idea you have that you think can help the team. Present your ideas and potential solutions and ask for feedback to learn what he or she thinks. At the least, you put the subject out there and make sure poor communication might not be the issue in the long term. If you can start an open dialogue about the problem, you can begin working towards a solution. You might not totally agree with the end result, but one thing's for sure, avoidance is not the answer. Our guest today is Chuck Gounaris, Greater Pittsburgh Regional Chair of Vistage International and a strategy guru who coaches CEOs focusing on executive team building with his firm, Gounaris & Associates. Chuck, welcome to the show.
Good to see you, Dave.
So, Chuck, we've got a lot to talk about. And I want to give full disclosure, we're both big predictive index guys, both huge into management and leadership strategies and personal professional growth. So this will be a fun one. Let's start way back, even to your education and then your first job after school. Walk us through your educational background and your career journey.
I had an interesting, I'd start out by saying I graduated from Penn State College and majored in management, minored in computer science. But I actually even began that education prior to that at a specialty high school up in Johnstown, as a matter of fact, where I was a computer science major, believe it or not, in 11th or 12th grade. So it was really early in my life. I knew I liked systems and how things got done, and that carried through most of my career, and it just translated directly over into the leadership space. So after Penn State, worked for EDS in the days of Ross Perot. Initially was a systems engineer, software design, development, and implementation types of stuff. Moved into roles that were related to marketing and program management. So I had P&L responsibility for a couple of engagements that were in both public and private experience. After EDS, had a stint at General Public Utilities, and in that was responsible. It was really interesting because at the time, GPU was getting ready for deregulation, and I was interested because it was a different model, a different environment, a different culture, one that was under a regulatory kind of fashion and wanted to become deregulated. So how do you shift a culture and change it? And that experience was really around that, driving cultural change, getting leadership to kind of act and operate in a different way. So I was there for a number of years and then went to IBM. At the time that the IBM Consulting Group was being formed, and that was their interest in me because of the background at EDS and industry experience out with GPU. So was involved at IBM for over 10 years, ended up being a principal in the consulting practice, and that's really where I spent a lot of time developing my strategy experience and business process management expertise, et cetera. And then when I left IBM, I went to work for Nova Chemicals, and that was a really great opportunity for me to be able to see what it was like for an organization that had been put together through the acquisition of 4 or 5 companies. So there were a lot of subcultures that existed, and it was very challenging and interesting to figure out how do you get people to work together in teams and share a common vision, drive toward a common end result, end game, and get everybody working together. So I had a couple of responsibilities there, but ended up running one of their chemical businesses. It was a $250 million chemical business that was involving expandable polystyrene. At the end of that stint, and the company was sold right around the 2008 timeframe. Remember, we had the big, what do they call it, a liquidity adjustment that happened in our world. And Nova was a public company, was sold to a group out of the Middle East, and I left along with a number of the other members of the management team at that time, and really stood back and said, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? Because over 30 years of my career had gone by, 35 years, I guess, at that point in time. And what I thought about it was just all the unique things I learned about leadership, culture, how important it was for people to work together. And that led me to going into business for myself, and that connected me to Vistage fairly early on. And when I discovered the values of Vistage and their history, I got really engaged in it. So I've been in business for myself now for a little over 5 years. And as you said, as a chair with Vistage International, and also doing a couple of specialty things around strategy, executive team development, culture work.
We got to dive right in because there's so many things to talk about. Well, let's start off with a fun one. Ross Perot at EDS. Now, we're in a presidential cycle here in which it's similar to 92.
Yeah.
And when Ross Perot ran for president. So I guess I just want to ask a little bit about how often did you see him around? How much interaction do you have? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, he was a really, one of the things that I learned from Ross Perot, and I saw him a number of times. I ended up way back when Ross decided he was going to go into government services, and they asked around the company, anybody want to go to Washington, D.C. to work? I raised my hand, and 4 weeks later, I'm in Washington, D.C., finding a place to live and ready to go. It was great. It was a wonderful time in my life. And I saw him a number of times there. What I liked about Ross from a leadership was his leadership style. He was just a guy who kind of was very good at being able to paint a vision and having everybody that worked for him in the organization believe that we could do far more than what we thought we could do for ourselves, just by working together, that we were better than any of us imagined that we were individually. And so he just kind of raised the bar and managed to get us to do some things that many people thought were impossible. And I think it was purely because of his leadership style. He was a very good leader.
So when you say you went to D.C. and worked in government services, that wasn't the campaign?
No, the campaign was after I was at EDS. Okay. It was much later. So I only know him from a business. I mean, I'm familiar with him whenever he was running for office because he had a lot of the same mannerisms and attitudes. Take charge. Yes. We can knock it down. We can do anything, and those same behavioral profiles that you saw then were how he led the company.
Interesting stuff. Did you vote for him?
I'm not going to answer that.
So we have another Ross Perot type in this year's campaign, right. Donald Trump, and their messaging is what gets them, their leadership style and their messaging is what gets them to where they have a chance at the big prize. So then you go into GPU, yes. And the phrase that I wrote down as you were talking was you were driving cultural change, and that really rings true to me because you talk a lot when you and I have conversations about cultural change. So that was one of your early experiences with driving cultural change. Talk about GPU's cultural change.
Well, the interest that was going on at GPU at the time is that it was a combination of operational excellence and cultural change. Those two themes were the big themes. And, what that culture, it was in a regulatory environment, that culture was pretty much a command and control. It just kind of like somebody above said something and people just went out and did it. And when I came in, it was really about starting to say, hey, let's just set a vision for where we want to go. We want to accomplish, we want to shift this culture so that we're able to be more of a high performance type organization and do things more cost effectively, do things very efficiently, and get ready for deregulation. So that means all of us have to weigh in on this. Just because I might be a leader or somebody above me doesn't mean we know all the answers. What it really became important to do is shift the culture so that we understood how to begin to work together in teams and forget about titles, forget about, just get focused on how do we get to the end game. And that was a really exciting learning for me as I spent, 6 or 7 years there. And I think we had a very successful stint in terms of both driving readiness from an operational point of view, how work got done, how work flowed, and how we worked together and how the leadership team worked together. It was really great.
So we have listeners out there that now they're probably saying, well, that's nice to hear, but maybe they don't believe it can happen. And I think since it was in a public utility, it would be even harder. It reminds me of in my nonprofit days when I was in a large nonprofit organization, we had to change culture. Talk about how you did it and give me a little bit more specific successes where you saw movement of the culture.
Well, it was a really insightful question that you had, because the fact is, at the end of the first year, right, I was used to being so energized, so excited, so enthused about how I could get things done at EDS that I was frustrated by the end of the first year, because I felt like there was always a reason why not, instead of a focus on how. How can we get there? And I wondered, as a matter of fact, at the end of that first year, whether I made a good decision to go there or not. Part of my decision was personal. It gave me an ability to get back home, and I had, get my kids back around the family, et cetera. But around year 2, it shifted. And what I learned is the importance of being able to have a shared vision as to where we were going. So we knew we had some specific metrics around operating cost and productivity and effectiveness, and also leadership readiness. So we had some specific objectives that we had to accomplish. And we developed a strategy that involved using changes in the way work flowed, information systems and technology, and really began to set up work teams that really embraced driving this change over a period of a couple of years. We invested very heavily in technology in those days and just radically changed the way work got done, all the way from the office up to the engineering staff, out to the plant locations. And along the way, really by getting people involved, people got more comfortable. They began to make decisions. They weighed in and offered their point of view. And I think we made better caliber decisions as a result of it, in terms of the direction that we were headed in. We had great results.
That's exciting to hear, because running into that roadblock of that's the way we've always done it instead of let's get it done, and you saw a shift. So let's move into one of the biggest names, one of the biggest brands in the history of branding, from a management standpoint, a consulting standpoint, IBM. IBM, maybe today it's not what it was, but in the 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, it was big time, one of the top 5 brands. It's still a very well-known brand.
Yes.
So you go there and you start you're with them as they're starting the IBM Consulting Group, and you ultimately became a principal in the consulting practice. That's pretty impressive. Tell us how that was in those days.
It's another interesting experience, because I had that same mindset, right? I had worked with IBM while I was at EDS. I had worked with IBM while I was at GPU, a number of other companies as well. And when approached with the idea of coming into the organization to help build the IBM Consulting Group, it was known by about a half a dozen names, actually, over the first few years. But in the end, it became IBM Global Services. The thing that was interesting is when I got on the inside and started to look around, it was very different than the way it appeared on the outside. I mean, they did a great job in their messaging in terms of, we're the leaders, we know where we're going. Because when I walked in, after having had a personal computers that did all sorts of slick things, and they gave me a green screen terminal, and I said, "This is IBM." It was a real shock to me for a little while. But in fact, what the leadership said is, and the other thing that was really interesting, by the way, is 2 months after I was hired and started, the hiring freeze happened. And it was the beginning of Gerstner coming in and unwinding the old IBM in order to prepare for the new IBM. So I was right at the front end cusp of that. In fact, it probably took a year before that momentum really got to going. What I learned there, and it's really very relevant to what you do, Dave, is that over the period of Gerstner's term, what we recognized is that IBM took its eye off the marketplace. They got very confident and very comfortable in the success of the past. So there were some cash cows that were in the hardware business and the software business and other dimensions of it, and they lost sight of the market. And the market was saying, we want things to be easier and simpler, et cetera. And the view was, and so to net it out in the end, there was a major gap between what IBM was offering in hardware and software technology and the solutions that customers wanted to be able to operate more efficiently, to be able to execute strategy. I mean, it just, when I think back over my career, all these things tied together. It almost was as if somebody was designing the fact that I started it with Perot at EDS and learned some things, and then went to GPU and then went to IBM, because it was all about how do you deliver solutions and do it in an effective way. How do you provide leadership to that? How do you work together in teams to get that end game done? And how do you really transform businesses? And it took 10 years. It was the 5th to 10th year before we really figured it out. I mean, it was a lot of struggling in the first couple of years, because I don't think people took IBM very seriously in those days, because they didn't pay close attention to the market. But once they figured out that was the problem, and we really got ourselves aligned with the marketplace and let the market drive the direction that we were going in, we saw tremendous growth. And I think that growth continues, although today. And
it's about understanding your market and listening to them. So when I look at your career path, and I want to make sure we spend some time on this, and we'll tie it back to PI, because you did it without PI. Mm-hmm. But what I've found fascinating with the guests of the show, and even when I look at my career, it looks like it makes all this sense, and you're like, wow, this guy did what he should. Like when you look at my career path, it makes complete sense that I got to where I am. Yeah. But while it was going on, I had no clue. I had no clue. Yeah. So I want to make sure everybody understands that, because even these, you're a big name guy, and I get these guests come in, and Suzanne's here as our producer, and I look at her career path, and I swear it looks like it was all mapped out to be right here, because we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, but along the way, you're not quite sure.
Absolutely. A lot of that.
So what made you make the leap to Nova after IBM?
Well, the big leap at IBM is that, the last 5 years, whenever I was a principal in the consulting practice, we had to grow that business by 100% every year. And so when you're leading a practice and having to grow at 100% rate every year, staying in Pittsburgh, and I was in a couple of different industry segments, wholesale distribution, industrial, and ended up in process industries, which was, the Bayers and the Alcoas, the chemical companies, aluminum companies, those kind of guys. It was hard to continue to get that growth out of just this regional market. And so in the consulting type businesses, the view was, well, let's expand the territory, so to say. Let's broaden the market. And so it went to a more regional model. And for me to stay with IBM, I would have had to move to either Detroit or Chicago back at the time. And I had promised my kids, and plus I had a personal desire to want to be in Pittsburgh, because my family was nearby up in Johnstown, and I wanted the kids to be accessible to their parents, grandparents, etc. And I just said, well, I wasn't going to do that. And so they gave me some time, and I found a role out at Nova Chemicals, and that's where I ended up landing as the next step.
So you go to Nova, and you said there were 4 to 5 subcultures that exist, and you had to get people to work together. So again, the pattern comes back to your natural ability to kind of build cultures, meld cultures, and coach cultures. Yeah. So you had 4 or 5 subcultures. Talk about how difficult that was.
Well, it was interesting, because one of the things when presented with the opportunity, I didn't go to Nova initially just to run the business. I had a role working for the CIO. And to be able to help integrate, get systems aligned with the business strategy. So there was a systems business strategy component. And then after a couple of years of successful changes that we implemented, was offered the opportunity to be able to run a business. It was the expandable polystyrene business at Nova. And that just kind of continued to build on the idea of setting a vision for growth, putting together, working with a team of people to be able to get to that growth, and then driving execution. I learned a really big lesson, though, during that time at Nova. So I continued to validate the importance of how much systems matter in the way workflow gets done. But what was interesting is that we had a lot of different personalities on the business team running that I ran for the expandable polystyrene business: sales personalities, engineering personalities, plant managers, etc. And one of the things that I learned really in the last 5 years, looking back, that I didn't realize at the time, is how important constructive conflict is in the leadership process. You really have to, conflict is such a great tool to be able to make sure that the best possible decisions are being made within an organization. And I didn't recognize it at the time. I tended to feel like, hey, let's not get too intense here. Let's calm down. Let's just talk. And I think that was a mistake when I look back. I think that we could have made a few better decisions if we'd have just allowed that to flow. In a non-judgmental way, that's really what was significant. But I didn't learn that until I got into my 50s, and it took me a long time to get up to that point. I'd say that was one of the biggest lessons that I gained out of the experience. It was still about working together as a team. It was still about getting much clearer about a vision for growth and how we were going to get there, and then executing, driving it to get it done. But the culture was important, and the way that we did that, how we trusted one another, how we engaged in conflict, how we made commitments to one another, meaning that we bought in and agreed to a particular direction, how we fostered accountability within the organization. All those things evolved over the 6-7 years that I was there that led us to consistently profitable results.
Awesome career track, and we're going to get into Vistage a lot because we're both passionate about it. But I want to go to something that we've all seen, or I jokingly say smelled, bullshit in the workplace. So I want you to give me an example from the past when it could be a company culture, questionable leadership, or poor work ethic, a time when you just had to say, bullshit. That's our little bullshit button, Chuck.
Yeah. I think that, that's a tough one, because to be frank with you, I think one of the things that I was blessed with was having the opportunity to have leaders that were often more about what was best for the organization as a whole and how we all worked together to be able to get there. So when I think back at the times with Perot, I mean, maybe you could say a little bit of it is that we were convinced at EDS that no matter how tough it was to take that flag, and Perot used a lot of military examples as you remember, like, we're going to take the flag, we're going to charge the hill. We love it when everybody says it's impossible. But he kind of drove it to that. I suppose you could look at that and say maybe there was a little bit of unrealism in it, but really the way he led, it caused everybody to believe that. I mean, I think it just caused us all to grow and go beyond. I think that probably if I had to think back at it, I'd probably go, because I think there was a lot of realism at GPU too. They recognized we can't survive and function in a deregulated environment the way things were done before. Maybe I'd point to the very first year that I was at IBM, because there was definitely a view that, we're IBM, and, look at all the great things that we did, and they did do a lot of great things over the history, but there wasn't an appreciation or a recognition of the fact that we were out of alignment with the marketplace. And that is what really began to drive growth down. It began to really drop off. So, call it bullshit. I mean, bullshit is when your belief system is such that says, hey, our success in the past is going to have a direct bearing on our success in the future. I don't think that was very realistic. Mm-hmm. And it took a couple of years for us to be able to figure that out. And it was really and I'll tell you, the big change was Gerstner whenever he came in, because he was much more systematic and methodical. And the fact is, IBM knew all the things that needed to be done way before I got there. They just didn't do it because they felt like they could ride on the successes of the past. And things changed. The market changed. What we needed to deliver and how we needed to deliver it changed. And we didn't recognize that until late in the game. Mm-hmm. But once we got it figured out again, things started to grow.
That's a great answer. So let's move into putting you on the spot personally. Talk about a learning experience.
I thought that's what you've been doing, is putting me on the spot personally.
No. That was easy. That's talking about general BS.
All right.
Talk about a learning experience when maybe you were the BS employee, maybe you were a tough boss, or maybe your communication wasn't quite what it needed to be. Looking back, when do you think you might have been guilty of some BS?
I think the only thing, I'll tell you what immediately comes to mind, Dave, and I still even feel it sometimes today. Today I'm working with CEOs, presidents, owners of businesses many times, and every now and then, our own self-concept will get in the kind of come to bear and say, you got to really be careful about what it is you say and advise and offer as perspective. in many ways because of the leverage that kind of comes out of that. But that was also the thing that attracted me to kind of getting involved in this role with Vistage. And it's just my belief about leadership in general, and I know you've heard me say this before, but I'm convinced after well over 40 years now in a variety of different leadership roles in companies that leadership is the transforming power that changes the trajectory of companies and the lives of the people who work for them. And I feel like that's what I want to try to have an effect on. And every now and then, the self-talk can kind of get a little bit of a challenge. But I keep striving to kind of find that and working with people who care about that, people who care about wanting to drive growth, but doing it in a specific way.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. So I want to move into something we're both passionate about, and that is marketing. And Chuck, you understand marketing. And when I give you this definition, it's going to ring true to you because it's kind of not the exact words that are used by the business schools and preached by the thought leaders, but it's my twist on that. And not a lot of people actually do understand marketing. So when we talk about marketing at Mass Solutions, we say it's about clearly defining your target audiences.
Yeah.
Then going out and finding out what they want through marketing intel. Going into the marketplace, talking to people, doing the necessary intel and research and mystery shopping, whatever you have to do to find out what they want. Come back to management and leadership and say, this is what we found out, and we're close, but we need to tweak A and B, and we probably should stop doing C. So that means you develop it. You tweak your products and services and develop it if you don't already have it. And then you give it to them when and where they want it at a price they're willing to pay. And then you tell them about it again and again. Unfortunately, a lot of people get hung up on that last part, the telling. But you have to do that intel, and you have to tweak the product and service, and you have to give it to them when and where they want it at a price they're willing to pay, because then the telling about it can be the fun part. So hearing that definition of marketing, think back to what's been your most amazing moment in your experience with marketing. What's your biggest marketing success?
Well, I think that the biggest successes were really in the last. I'd say that actually in the last three leadership opportunities that I had. One at IBM, it was the second 5 years of my 10 plus years that I was there. And that is, once we began to listen to the marketplace in terms of what they want and began to offer it, it was so much easier to have the market pull what we had, to offer through instead of us having to try to push it through. And that was when I really began to recognize the value and power of marketing was during my time at IBM. Similarly, at Nova, I ran a business that had a fairly significant component that was a commodity chemical product and a small piece that was specialty. And just given the competitive dynamics on a global basis, if I would have just let that commodity business continue to run, margins were being squeezed, profitability was coming way down, and our team really decided to focus in a significant way on the specialty side of the business. And we went out and met with 5 or 6 of our top customers and entered into what I would call strategic partnership types of programs where we understood and focused on what were their growth strategies and what was key when they looked out over the next 3 to 5 years. And we shared what our growth strategy was and what was key for us. And then we figured out where the synergies were and put together a joint program where we could work together that would create a win-win for both of us. And that was so powerful because just through one of those, we had a very significant amount of growth on the specialty side of our business, which added considerably for a couple of years to the profitability and margin. And again, what I learned is that if you listen to what other organizations are doing and have a clear picture of where they want to take their business and what their game plan is to get there, and you find synergies that are there, and you implement those things together, you can both win. You can both grow. And I learned that at that point. Now, when I look back, and when I look at the time, a little over 5 years now with Vistage as a chair, I see it repeatedly with business owners that are running businesses that are anywhere from a few $1 million in revenue to 5 or 10 employees to $500 million in revenue and 1,000 employees. Those that are tuned in that are market facing and look at the marketplace and really understand what is happening out there. What are the value drivers that are out there? What's the strategy that their key clients are undertaking? And the and look for opportunities where they can help improve profitability for their customers or help their customer move more effectively toward their strategy. Again, it's so much easier to be able to have the market pull what you have through than you having to sell it, to push it. And so that whole concept of push-pull is really just an interesting back perspective I have about marketing in the past. When you're not doing it right, you're pushing. Whenever you're doing it right, you're being pulled. Then it's about, how do I build capacity quickly enough to be able to grow?
Wow, I'm excited. That's if you want to talk a definition of marketing and applying it and realizing that sales, marketing, sales, they're not the same thing. That's a great answer from Chuck Gounaris, the guest today on the No BS Marketing Show. I'm your host, Dave Mastovich. How can listeners contact you if they'd like to learn more about what you do?
Well, obviously, they can get a hold of me through you, if that would be the case. Or I'm happy to give you a phone
What about
number.
your LinkedIn?
Our LinkedIn is a great way. That's a good way. And my contact information and all that is available on LinkedIn.
We'll put it all on the show notes.
That's excellent. Thank you.
That way anyone can get to you. Chuck, thanks for being on the show. It was a pleasure.
That was great. I really enjoyed it. Although I was pretty nervous about coming here, I really enjoyed it.
What made you nervous?
You.
Absolute bullshit.
Thanks for joining us for the No Bullshit Marketing Podcast. Visit boldsolutionsnobs.com for show notes plus additional marketing and messaging resources. Or you sign up for light reading, you'll receive valuable strategies every other week to improve your marketing and transform your message. It really is light, intended to be read in 2 minutes or less, and it just might trigger bright ideas for you. To sign up, visit masssolutions.biz. That's B-I-Z. Remember, ask yourself, what's the big idea? And build your story around the answer. It's all about bold solutions.